And I'm so happy to be here with you all today as we recommit to the ideals that Martin Luther King inspired, and reflect on his vision for our country. I was actually thrilled to see that you guys picked education to be the theme as you celebrate Martin Luther King. The passport to the dream. We hear a lot about how education is important to our country because it's important to our economic competitiveness. We hear it's important to our national security. And I think it's far more fundamental than that. Professor Ruff talked this morning about without education, we don't have opportunity. And I think it goes to our ideals as a country. It goes to, the vision that we have and the nation that we aspire to be. And so I think it's really wonderful that you have picked education to be the what we call actually today's most pressing civil rights issue. I wanted to start with a video. We're having tech issues, so you're going to be stuck with me talking 5 or 10 minutes longer than I had planned. But I wanted to really take this time. I know that we spent the morning when Tim King was really talking at a very high level about the values that Martin Luther King, Dr. King, captured and encouraged in all of us. And we talked about, how education, the role that education plays in that. I wanted to take it to the here and now in terms of, what successes, what progress have we made today in education reform? What are the battles that are up ahead? And what role can each of you play in helping us make sure that we truly take our work to that next level? Professor Ruff encouraged me to start to tell a little bit about my story. I know this looks like we have about 80 or 90% students in the audience, and I know you thought that a little bit of my background might be of interest, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. But my story started when I was a senior in college, and I had intended to be a lawyer, very well laid plans, but I wasn't ready for 3 more years of law school, and so I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And the last week before winter break of spring of my senior year, we all woke up, every senior at Yale University woke up to find a flyer underneath our door. The flyer was just a simple black and white Xerox piece of paper, and it called upon us to join a new movement for education opportunity, to teach for 2 years in low-income schools across the country, and to become lifetime advocates for education reform. That was the very start of Teach for America. As Professor Ruff talked about, a young lady back then named Wendy Cox, she was 23 at the time. She had just graduated from Princeton University. She had written in her senior thesis this idea of a national teacher corps that would call upon the nation's future leaders and ask us to dedicate 2 years of our life to teaching and to spend the rest of our life working from all different sectors to try and chip away the bar education reform issue. Her premise was that, great teachers are absolutely critical to solving the education problem in this country, but they weren't sufficient. And we really needed future policymakers, we needed, reporters and editors, we needed business corporate leaders, we needed university presidents, we needed everybody really focused, because it was a multi-dimensional problem, at chipping away different aspects of it. So by the end of that day, a couple of friends had handed me their flyer, pushed it into my hands, and I knew that was going to be my next thing. 9 months later, after what we now call a boot camp, we went through 5 weeks of very compressed teacher training in Los Angeles at the time. Again, taught mostly by 23-year-olds. I found myself walking the first day of school into PS 307, which is an elementary school in Brooklyn, New York. Right underneath, I don't know how many of you have been to New York City, but it's underneath the shadows of the Manhattan Bridge. 98% of the students came from across the street, and what was back then one of the most difficult public housing complexes in the city. And, I was myself 22 at the time, and so I was trying my best to act and look like a teacher. I still remember I put on my best outfit. I had a skirt and a teacher shirt on and a teacher bag. And, came into the front door, started walking down toward my classroom, and I heard the security guard, yelling at somebody to go back into the playground because the bell hadn't rung yet. So I turned around to see what the commotion was, and I realized there was nobody else in the hallway. So the security guard was talking to me. And this was an elementary school, so the oldest I could have been was 12 years old. I really did not have an auspicious start to my first year teaching. It wasn't an easy year, but I learned a ton. My kids tested me relentlessly, and they taught me at every turn how to be a better teacher. Once I forgot how to lay the ground rules for when my kids can go to the bathroom, and after one kid left without my permission, literally every single kid flopped out and without my permission. Another time, how many of you guys know, well, this might be a little before your time, Homer Simpson? Anybody? Yeah, so one time, after a month unit studying the Greek poet Homer, I signed, as one option to write a report on the life of Homer. And due date, I got back literally 3 reports on the life and times of Homer Simpson. That cursing cartoon character. But the most important lesson I learned was also the saddest, which is how much talent we're leaving behind as a country. My students at PS 307, 4th and 5th graders, all of them, they grew up in conditions that no one, much less a kid, should have to grow up in. Whether it be drug deals taking place outside their door, gunshots at night, where the custodian, when he would see me putting up bulletin boards, grading papers at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, would urge me to go home because he was afraid for my safety. And this was a neighborhood that my 9 and 10-year-olds were having to face every day. My kids came to school hungry. A lot of them came without, you hear that, they come without glasses to see. And then when they went home after the school day, they had to take care of siblings, and they had to do chores, and they had no quiet place to study. It's no surprise what happens to the majority of these children. By 4th grade, they're 2 to 3 grade levels behind. By 9th grade, if they make it that far, they're reading and doing math at a 5th grade level. Only 1 out of 2 will graduate from high school, and less than 1 out of 10 will graduate from college. The tragedy is that when you get to know these kids, and I got to know I got to know many of them up close, you see that it doesn't have to be that way. When I was a teacher, I saw that every single one of my kids had a passion, something they were truly excited about, that overlapped with their many talents. My best moments were when I was able to bring out a little bit of that passion. During my 2nd year teaching, I still remember Letitia, who was often teased by her classmates, won the lead role in our class play. After the performance, her teacher the prior year came up to me, completely surprised, saying how shocked she was that Letitia was performing so effortlessly on stage when back in the 4th grade she would sit sullen and quiet in class, never speaking up. Letitia went on to become one of my best students with a particular passion and talent in writing and reading. In 2003, when I came back to lead Teach for America's expansion across New York City, I was responsible ultimately for 1,000 teachers. And in that role, it became obvious to me, I learned a lot of things, but it became obvious to me that at the end of the day, the teacher, the adult in the room, can make all the difference. One day, I wanted to see the impact that a teacher could have. So I visited one of our schools in the Bronx, where we had about 15 teachers. And the interesting thing was that the students would be taught by different teachers. So I literally had 3 or 4 Teach for America core members, we call them, teach the same set of students. And in one classroom, the same group of kids, I would see one of our teachers, interact with the kids, and the kids looked like the stereotypical, teenagers that you read about in the paper who don't care about learning, who are disrespectful, who are taking every moment, to squander away time in the classroom, out of their seats. At any second you feel like the whole classroom is going to fall into disarray. One class period later, the exact same group of kids, different teachers, still remember Eugene Lang. He was teaching something that didn't seem that exciting. It was some grammar class. The kids were dead silent when he was talking, and when he asked for the kids' response or for contributions, they were literally falling out of their seats to contribute. And when I saw that, the same group of kids taught by a different teacher responded so differently, it became obvious to me that it wasn't about the kids, it was about the adults. By the end of that year, it wasn't a surprise what the outcomes were. The kids in Joe Negro's class had progressed literally 2 to 3 grade levels on average. And in the other teacher's class, they had barely made any progress at all. Here at I Have a Dream, we see the same thing play out every day. We have 29 affiliates across the country, and when you look at the performance of our affiliates, there's a striking variation among the top performers. Our top performers are graduating 90% plus of their kids from high school. And I'm sorry to say our lowest performers, and thankfully there aren't that many of them, are doing no better than status quo. Maybe 50% are graduating from high school. And when I look at that again, it's become very clear it's not about kids, it's about the adults and what we're doing. The question we have as a nation is not, can we close the achievement gap? Having seen what I've seen, I think the question becomes, will we? Do we have the will to do it? And when I saw this, I knew I couldn't walk away. When you see the juxtaposition between what is and what can be, it's really difficult not to stay in with it. I've been working in education reform now for about 20 years, and in some ways I've never been more optimistic in terms of the progress that's been made. 20 years ago was a barren landscape. Teach for America was such a novel idea. There was huge skepticism over whether or not we could get some of the nation's most talented young people to commit 2 years to teach. This past year, I think they got 60,000 applications from 400 to 500 universities across the country, competing to work in very difficult situations, making pretty much no money, when these young people could be working in any of the top firms across the country, to the point where literally the McKinseys of the world, the Goldman Sachs, realized they couldn't compete with Teach for America for the same young people, so they're partnering. So now, if you interview with both, McKinsey or Goldman Sachs will let you defer your offer to the firm to Teach for America for 2 years. And back then, we didn't have Tim King School. Tim King School is one of several hundred now across the country that are working as an explicit mission, low-income kids across the country who have a 10% probability of graduating from college, and they're setting their eyes on nothing short than 80% college graduation. Now there are literally hundreds of schools like that across the country. The way that the media reports, I remember back in 2006, Paul Tuff, some of you may have read his work, New York Times reporter back then, he had a breakthrough article. It was the first time, there's been this raging battle about can you fix poverty before you fix schools, or can you fix schools before you fix poverty? At the end of the day, it's not that simple, right? You sort of have to fix both in parallel. But Paul Tuff, until then, the prevailing sentiment was you can't begin to put a dent in schools until you fix quote-unquote poverty. Paul Tuff was the first mainstream reporter to come out in 2006 with an article that essentially said, that looked at a few of these schools that were just bubbling up. KIPP, Not-Just Power Program, which is started in Texas and New York, seeing the kids that we had given up on, are across the entire school succeeding at a level that really was at the same level as a middle-income kid growing up in New York or Houston, Texas. And he wrote that it's actually possible. Before we fix poverty, we can make sure that kids can have an excellent education, and we can't wait until poverty is fixed. We're seeing talent, as I mentioned, flooding the space. It's incredible. Every week I get calls from several people from the private sector who want to make this switch. They want to make sure, they realize that time is the greatest currency in their lives, and they want to make sure they're using their time wisely. And they're seeing the progress that has been made in education and the role they can play. So in so many ways, the last 20 years, it's pretty incredible where we are today. At the same time, I think the big question now is, are we going to squander the opportunity? We never thought we would see a time when mayors across the country are appointing, the top person to lead the public schools. When we have an Arne Duncan in office at the federal level driving change. When the public media that used to be backing the status quo is all of a sudden backing reform. And the big question is, are we going to fully leverage this window of opportunity? And as I look forward ahead, I feel like there are a couple of challenges that we are really going to have to focus on. The first is, while we have come very far from where we started, we're still very far from where we need to be with our kids. The top school reformers in that country, schools like Tim King's. Tim, I think, too early to call, and no doubt he'll do incredibly well. But KIPP, which is one of the top schools in the country now, they have 100 plus schools serving low-income kids in many states across the nation. They have sent 90% of their kids to college, and only 33% are completing. And when you think about that, they took, the high school graduation rate has historically been 50% for our kids. They took it to 98%. The college enrollment rate has historically been between 20 to 30% for our kids, maximum. And they took it to 90%. The historical rate for college completion is 10% for our kids. They've taken it to 33%. But that's not good enough. Their goal is to take it to 80%, which is the top quartile in our country. And so that's a big issue, that we've gotten so far with our kids. And now that they've gotten to what we thought was the end game to college, we're seeing this massive drop-off. And so we need to that's a huge problem that's across the horizon for all these innovative schools. And so I think that's going to be a huge area of focus. The second area of concern is, the fact that we have not done a good enough job bringing along everybody else. So there's been a growing divide between different people working in education, where now the education reformers are alienating a lot of the other people who are working with the same kids. I mean, I'll just be transparent here. There have been a lot of battles with the teachers union, and I think rather than engage the teachers union, they've been trying to squash, and sort of break down the teachers union. Families and parents, there's growing, literally in some pockets of the country where we have a lot of incredible work happening to build great schools for great kids. We're trying to shut down schools that are broken, and the parents of the kids are defending the schools that are getting shut down. It's not because they don't care, but they care quite a bit, but it's because we haven't done a good enough job communicating to parents, and their affiliation tends to be with the schools that their kids are enrolled in. And so we're seeing a lot of that. We're spending a ton of energy trying to address the politics of it, and it's beginning to create fracture, to create sort of division. And so I think that's one thing. I call it the demand side. We're going to have to do a much better job building excitement and engagement across the broader community with all those other folks that are well-intended and working with the same group of kids. The third main issue, I think, is internally. It's funny, as we get more successful, where now the press tends to be on our side on a lot of issues, and we're growing quickly. In some ways, we're becoming risk averse. In some ways, we're becoming defensive. And so we're getting to the point now where we are at risk of losing sight of the spirit that led us, that motivated us to begin with. And so, in many instances now, we're everything from when we look at our outcomes, if they're not good enough, we get, often test scores have become a big focus, and we're measured on test scores. And so we're at risk of being guilty for the very thing that we were trying to fight, which is, as we become more exposed and more celebrated, there's a fear of losing our success. And that's led to the unintended consequence of us focusing unduly on things that get measured and not thinking about all the broader things that are important to our kids. And the final thing, which is a little more, the bigger problem, I feel sometimes that we are chasing the wrong bus. So we are we've built up a whole infrastructure, all these great schools, these human capital, initiatives like Teach for America, New Leaders for New Schools, building new school leaders, around the existing school system. And in some ways, the existing school system is not going to be the system of the future. And it's a real difficult, even higher ed, I met with some of the leadership here just half an hour ago, and I was talking about how even the higher ed system, in some ways, is like healthcare, reform. There are some fundamental problems with our model, both K-12 and higher ed. And so we're building everything we do around the current system without an eye toward the future system. And that will involve things like using technology in a different way. It will involve things like, recalibrating human capital in a different way. But it gets tricky because our millions of kids need to go through the current system, be successful in the current system. But we don't want that to hold us back from exploring new models of delivering education. So those are some of my worries, and I think I think those are the challenges that all of us working in education reform are going to need to focus on moving forward. In terms of you all, I was saying earlier, this whole 90%, 33% completion problem, I mean, that is a significant problem. And one thing I've reflected a lot on is that most of the work that's been done, you know, when we talk about education reform, has been at the K-12 level. And we haven't done a good job inviting colleges around the table. And so as a result, you know, we've done all this work, we're taking all these kids to 11th grade, 12th grade. They're beginning to start college, and we have not communicated clearly with the colleges. And so, you know, one big thing that we are going to be working on moving forward is beginning to invite colleges to join this barter movement, and to invite colleges to take the baton pass. And I really do think that's going to be the next frontier. It's basically calling upon the higher education community to join this movement for educational equity. And I think the best asset that colleges have are actually the students. And so some of you guys have already reached out to me to ask, you know, how you can get involved. And I think one big thing that we're thinking a lot about is how can we rally the college community to begin to take this baton as we hand kids off to the next step.